And this is just one where, like, I think this is how most teams end up stuck in the middle. Just because you like vets, it's okay to move them. It's okay to get them off your roster for something.
And that's going to come back to bite you in the butt because you didn't do any research with that new information.
And then you end up, falling short, and then you're in a tough spot if you don't know how to bounce back from that. But you could effectively be adding a year onto what could have been a fairly quick rebuild, depending on what the pieces are you're moving. I think that's when you're setting yourself up for trouble. There are some mistakes out there that can stop your dynasty in its tracks. Today, Zach and I are highlighting some of those along with the fix to those mistakes. You won't want to miss it because you could be guilty of these very common mistakes. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Comment down below your thoughts. Do you make any of these mistakes? And how are you going to fix that going forward? But hey, with all that said, let's get right to it. All right, Zach, talking some dynasty mistakes to avoid today. The first one I got on the docket, we're just going to hop right into this today. Possibly the most egregious mistake you can make in dynasty is not adjusting to new information. And this goes with like take lock, assuming that everything is fine when it isn't, when all signs seem to point the other way. And I think the biggest thing for me with this is you could use it as, do I need to pivot off a player? Do I need to make, whatever move? We have all offseason to project what players are going to do. And then we finally get gifted information at the start of the season. And you can choose to use that new information that you've been given and go acquire new players, move off of players that might still have hype around them that, hey, we don't really think these guys are going to do anything anymore. Or you can just sit on it and not do anything with it. And I think the worst thing you could possibly do is sit on a point and not do anything with it. What are your thoughts here on just not adjusting to new information? And then how do we fix this mistake itself?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think the thing, to take it a step further is like doing the research, right? And I'll give you a good example. We had Carson Wentz start off the season incredibly hot. And that's new information to absorb. But do the research, right? Like, who's Carson Wentz playing against? He played in week 1 and week 2 against the 31st and 32nd passing offense in the NFL in 2021. And the Commanders were down in the 3rd and 4th quarter of those games. So, obviously, the game script is going to say Carson Wentz needs to throw the ball. And there's no doubt, like, he has much better weapons. I won't say, like, than ever in his career because he was on a team that won a Super Bowl. But he's got much better weapons than he had skill position players than, say, in Indianapolis last year. But at the same time, like, he's trailing 22-14 to the Jaguars week 1 in the 4th quarter. Of course he's going to start throwing the ball. Look, Carson Wentz is obviously putting up fantastic fantasy stats. If you have that information and you have Carson Wentz, don't start him, sell him, right? Use that information to your benefit because who has Carson Wentz been his entire career? A quarterback that puts up really good fantasy stats, but is not a really good NFL quarterback. Always take in that new information, but do the research for that extra step because, there was a lot of people in week 3 who started Carson Wentz who really regretted it, and that's the thing about the new information is you can take it in, you can, without doing research, Carson Wentz is the number 2 quarterback in fantasy. Let me start. Boom. And that's going to come back to bite you in the butt because you didn't do any research with that new information.
Absolutely. Like vetting that information is, because I don't think anybody, like you said, was expecting Wentz to do what he did. But then when he does, really break that down to see if it's for real is kind of the thing. And like I said, just avoiding take lock in general. The fix for this mistake is to absorb that new information and digest it. Does it make sense? Does it actually provide evidence that is going to point you in a new direction? Or does it actually make sense that this could be the new normal? If so, it's okay to change your opinion and admit you were wrong. Right. It's better to do that than to just be more wronger later. Because,
more wronger?
Yeah, absolutely. I said that intentionally. Thank you very much. Instead of being more wrong later, make the adjustment that you need to adjust to that new information. And instead of you take that mistake now and you make that into a positive and you adjust to, you learn that on the new information and you benefit from people who might have been buying into Carson Wentz after week 2. Could you imagine flipping Carson Wentz after week 2? Maybe getting in on a quarterback who, maybe people were a little lower on to start the season, like a Trevor Lawrence, who really popped off this past weekend and found a way to get to him from Carson Wentz. Could you imagine doing something like that? What that would do for your dynasty, as opposed to maybe you went and bought in on Carson Wentz? Huge mistake.
I think another good example there, Bob, real quick, is on the same team as the
Sure.
Commanders, right? Curtis Samuel. And I know
Yes.
I know a lot of people at the DR didn't really believe in Curtis Samuel before the
I
season.
still don't.
I don't want to say I like totally believed in it, but you always saw that potential. Like, you got to remember,
Sure.
this is an
Absolutely.
Ohio State wide receiver that in his last year in college had 800 rushing yards, 800 receiving yards, and 15 touch. Like, that's who Curtis Samuel's kind of like Debo Samuel, but on a coaching staff that's not offensive minded, right? Like, Debo's with Kyle Shanahan, Curtis Samuel's been with Ron Rivera his whole career, and he hasn't been healthy.
Sure.
Like, take that new information in. Look at, I think he has now through 3 games 30 targets. Curtis Samuel does. Like, that information is relevant. Plus, what did I just say? They're going to be trailing in every single game in the second half. So Curtis Samuel is a player that you might have missed the boat on. You know,
Sure.
the boat might have been that waiver wire week 1, or try to trade after week 1, because now we've seen this 3 or 4 weeks where Curtis Samuel is a very integral part of that offense, more than Terry McLaurin is, more than Jahan Dotson is. Like, he is the wide receiver 1 on that team. I think he's a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football right now. You know, that's information where you could say Curtis Samuel, not on a good team, but on a team that's going to be trailing every single game, has that ability to, like Debo Samuel, get handoffs in the backfield. He's a weapon for the Commanders. And, like, listen, they are not a good team. The offensive line is bad. The defense is bad. They're going to be losing almost every single fourth quarter. So that's kind of a player that, like I said, you might have missed the boat on, but that's information that you could have taken. And if you did the research, like we just said, you might have come out with a player that you could have gotten on the cheap. You could have gotten for free, just a couple fab dollars. I know some leagues he went for 50% of people's fab, which now it's looking pretty good. But, you know, just taking that information, doing the research, absorbing it, like you said, and then coming out with a decision one way or the other. And, you know, it's very easy to just, oh, this guy was the number 2 wide receiver, you know, I'm going to start. But, like, you have to do the research every week. That could come back to bite you if you don't at least take a few minutes and say, why are they scoring so many points? Are they a good team? Are they, do they have a good offensive line? XYZ. So it's a lot of information to take, but, like, it's how good do you want to be at fantasy football? Do you want to just put a starting lineup in every week and hope for the best, or do 10 minutes of homework every week and pick a starting lineup based on the research that you're acquiring?
Just to, wrap that up, I think for me, the big issue with Curtis Samuel, just picking on the example you chose, is still what I think that's going to look like long term. And I think right now in this moment, Curtis Samuel is somebody who we should take notice of. He is being utilized very heavily in that offense, more than anybody expected. You need to adjust to it. I'm adjusting to it in a way that if I had him anywhere, I would be looking to move him, because I don't believe in the long-term picture. But all that means is that you could probably get more for him than you ever could have trying to trade him before. So however, if you believe in him, hey, that's your prerogative. I'm fine with that. I'm not going to disagree with you or say you're wrong at this point, because he is putting up numbers. But I think it's still a matter of, what do you think it looks like long term? But the next bit I got, another mistake I think you can make as a win now or a competitive team, is overpaying too much to win now, focusing too much on the right now and not focusing on the big picture. Because I think what this can do is, if you win your league, awesome, great. Who cares? Kind of who cares. But, if you win your league and it's fine, cool, you won your league, you did what you came here to do. But if you sacrifice your entire future to do so, and this is only because I know there are so many teams out there who don't build up draft capital. They ride with the draft capital they're given, or they trade it all away, and they don't ever work on accruing all these extra assets. And this is why we harp on so much adding assets, building your asset pool, building your draft pick pool, squeezing the juice from the orange, like you always like to say.
I love it. I love that you use my euphemisms there.
I try. In this case, I just hate seeing teams that I see on the regular in my own leagues go, especially specifically around the trade deadline. When, players are, I would say, at their most valuable when rebuilding teams are looking to move them for draft capital. Okay, I get it. But I see so many times every year where there's multiple firsts being thrown around by the same team in the same trade, getting 1 or 2 pieces back that are short-term assets. And my issue with this is what it does to that team long-term is, while you are possibly setting yourself up to win now, you're kind of selling your soul for the future if you don't win that championship. Because if you don't win, who cares? Like in all honesty, like in essence, if you don't win, but you sold your soul to try to win, what is your team doing? So when I'm looking to win now, the fix for me on this one, I want to win now the right way. I want to pay up for players that are still somewhat young, especially if I'm moving a first round rookie pick in any of the upcoming drafts. See what younger players you can target using the same draft picks or capital that you were looking to pay to get some of these aging veterans like a Leonard Fournette, Michael Thomas, all these guys that are, on their way kind of out of supreme relevancy and high-end talent, and see if you can move those pieces for younger assets that are going to help you for a few years still. I want to reference a prime example for me in a league. I'm very competitive. It's really me and one other team are the two teams in this league, and everybody else is just kind of hanging out at this point. I hate to be like that, but it is really just, you look at points for, and it's not even in the same zip code. A guy had Zach Wilson, Trey Lance this season. As you know, those guys have not started out so hot. Trey Lance is already gone for the year. Zach Wilson gone for the first 4 weeks-ish, maybe more. And so he's like, hey, I'm going to rebuild. I'm done this year. I have Nick Chubb up on my block. There's a few other players I'm willing to move to that are older. And I'm like, I could use a Nick Chubb on my roster. So I go hit up this guy. I ended up sending Sky Moore a first in 2 seconds for Nick Chubb, which I thought was pretty fair value. I don't think that's terrible value at all. And he also had DeAndre Swift on his roster. Now, I made the mistake of assuming that I would not be able to get DeAndre Swift on that deal. And not even a day later, I think it might have been the same day, that other competitive team, that uber competitive team that I thought I just got a running back up on, traded a first round pick, Dameon Pierce, and a second for DeAndre Swift. And I'm like, if I would have just sent that offer, I don't know if I would have gotten it done with Sky Moore a first in 2 seconds, but man, it's just that what if I would have tried shooting for DeAndre Swift and maybe settling for Nick Chubb, if I could have sent that same exact package for DeAndre Swift, now that, banged up now at the moment, but still for the future, a much younger running back should have more tread on the tires long-term than Nick Chubb. Granted, Nick Chubb probably more stable for as long as he's going to be in the league. So it's one of those things where instead of overpaying or paying a lot to get these assets that are aging out, pay up to get these young guys, especially if you're moving first round picks that you don't have a ton of. First round picks are hard enough to come by. Don't move them for players that aren't going to be on your team and valuable and producing for at least a couple more years. Zach, what are your thoughts on this whole mistake here, overpaying when you're in win now mode?
Well, it's funny that you brought up like a Nick Chubb scenario because I was going to do the same. I was going to do the exact same. First, let me address your scenario, and then I'll get to mine to how it kind of relates to the story. Is for me, like it really depends on you're telling me that you're in a situation where your team is ready to compete. I'll put it this way: Nick Chubb is not Derrick Henry, right? Derrick Henry's 29 years old, but Nick Chubb is on a team right now with Jacoby Brissett, but they'll eventually be transitioning to Deshaun Watson. I don't know what that's going to look like right off the bat, but I think eventually Deshaun Watson will return to at least 80 to 90% of what he was. I'm assuming, but Nick Chubb is a player that I think is viable for the next 2-3 years at minimum, right? I don't know if Kareem Hunt's there next year. Maybe it's the Jerome Ford show. I know that Nick Chubb right now is a RB1 hands down. And you're in a situation where that piece could put you over the top for the next 2 to 3 years. DeAndre Swift always gets hurt. Always.
Yeah.
Death taxes DeAndre Swift out for 4 games every single year. Nick Chubb, he could get hurt. He could not, but he's a completely reliable back that when you put into your starting lineup, you feel confident for. And, you're in a situation where your team's competitive. You're ready to win now. And I don't think that next year Nick Chubb significantly loses value. You're a competitive team. You make a move for a player that puts you over the top. And I don't think that changes. I don't think that changes in the next 2 or 3 years. You may not be the favorite, but you're in the conversation every year with a Nick Chubb and an already competitive team. I was in a situation where I'm in the second year of taking over an orphan team. I had the number 1 pick last year. I traded it. I got Olave in the draft. And through 2 weeks, I was the high scorer in my league, 2-0. I have an opportunity here to compete for a championship without moving away from my rebuilding plan. When I took over the team, it was a 2-year rebuilding plan. I never thought after 2 weeks I'd be the high scorer in the league. We're talking like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Michael Pittman, Tyreek Hill, Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, J.K. Dobbins, so on and so forth. I reached out to the Nick Chubb owner, who I have as first round pick for next year. I have 3 first round picks in that league for next year. And I said, I have 3 first round picks. Your first round pick looks like it's going to be anywhere from 101 to 103. I'm not offering you this pick, but I will offer you one of my other first round picks, a second round pick, and I offered like Josh Palmer or Tyler Algier or a combination thereof. And the owner wants his first round pick back. And I've said, listen. Nick Chubb is not worth a top 4 pick in any rookie draft. I don't care. Like if I was a team competing for it, like that's just not proper value in my opinion. Yeah, he's a top 5 running back right now, but he can get written out of any kind of game script. You know, if it's a 30-10 game in the second half, that's a Kareem Hunt game. That's a game where Kareem Hunt's going to be involved in the passing game. You know, Nick Chubb's going to be in there, maybe a goal line situation. I'm not trading a top 3 potential pick in a rookie draft for Nick Chubb. So you have to be aware of that scenario where you, Bob, you're a competitive team and you're trying to acquire a piece to put you over the top. I'm ahead on my rebuild and I'm trying to acquire Nick Chubb, but I'm not going to do it at the sake of my 2-year, 3-year long-term rebuild. And the exact phrase that I said to this owner is, listen, because they're, you know, owners are going to try to peer pressure you. Oh, you're half in, you're half out, you're not committed, this and that. It's like, listen, I'm committed. I'm doing a great job on my rebuild. Your team's 0-2. All right. So first of all, don't tell me how to do this rebuild. Second of all, I'm trying to rebuild for the next 5 to 7 years, not the next 2 to 3. That's been my plan the entire time. Every single move I've made in this league has been to compete for the long-term picture. So it's like you said, you know, every situation depends on the circumstances and the details, but I could be in a win now situation while still trying to maintain a long-term rebuild, but I'm not going to sacrifice the long-term viability of a young, clearly good team for the sake of winning. I don't even think that move would put me over the top. There are some very good teams in that league. So I'm not going to put my long-term rebuild and overspend on a piece that can make me, you know, competitive in the championship picture in the next 2 to 3 years. So it's really situation dependent. I love that we both use Nick Chubb. You used it in a win now mode. I used it in a I'm rebuilding, but I actually have a very competitive team in this rebuild. So it's very situation dependent, but I always say, make a plan and stick to the plan. My plan when I took over this team, it was an orphan team. It was be bad the first year, acquire young players, buy injured players. I did that. You know, we picked up JK. We drafted Olave. We traded for Pittman before the second year breakout. You know, now we're in a position to be competitive in this league for 5, 6, 7, 8 years with that young core of players. And I'm not going to change that for Nick Chubb, who, you know, I agree for the next 2-3 years is probably a RB1, but my team isn't there just yet. So very situation dependent, but never overpay for a win now situation, because it could, like you said, Bob, put you in a situation where, you know, another owner could make a move. And now you're in a situation where you're not a title contender. And that's not you. I'm just saying somebody else. You're not a title contender because now you need to make another move. You need to catch up. Or in my situation, you're a young team. You're rebuilding, you have that plan in place, and somebody's trying to stop you from doing that for a like the thing that I feel that our audience, and I could be wrong here, Bob, is like our audience is a lot of new people to Dynasty. This is a long-term thing, man. This is not redraft. This is not for this year unless you're in a situation like Bob. And I think a lot of people that watch this channel and watch these videos are not in that situation. You know, they're seeking out information because they're in a dynasty league for the first time. They've taken over an orphan team, and when you take over an orphan team, it's usually a pretty crappy team. So you're trying to find every, you know, crumb and morsel to how to make your team better, and do not overspend on players that take away from your long-term plan.
I think I'd wrap that up by saying too that, you know, you can pay appropriate value in a lot of assets. I think that's fair to do, but this is why it's so important to build up draft capital and build up assets that you can move when you need to make these expensive purchases, when you need to go get a Nick Chubb, when you need to go get another top tier running back to make that push in your win now mode, or even a top tier wide receiver. I just did the same thing. I acquired Stefon Diggs 2 weeks ago. You know, it's one of those things where, but I had a ton of assets to move. It doesn't even look like a dent was made in my team. it doesn't look like I lost anything. And, that's just hard to get to, but that's why you need to, build up the assets first so that when you're in that mode, when you get into win now mode, you can spend those assets to get those premium players. But then the final note I'll have for this is much like when you're in a draft, you're taking best available player wherever you're at. Usually you try to avoid need at all costs. Do the same kind of thing when you're moving assets. If you have this cluster of assets to move, target the best available player you can get with that grouping of assets. We touched on it in some price check videos. The price on Leonard Fournette and Austin Eckler were pretty similar, but I'd much rather go get Austin Eckler. And it was the same kind of deal. Zeke Elliott was kind of in that mix too of, it kind of cost you a late 23 first. I'd much rather go get Fournette or Eckler over Ezekiel Elliott for why he was going for that much. Kind of rich for my blood, but it's one of those things, target the best available with the assets you're willing to move. And usually win now will come to you. We touched on it a little bit in this bit, but looking at roster, knowing your roster, I think one of the big mistakes people are making out there is overrating your own roster and ending up stuck in the middle. I feel as though too often we see teams that see themselves as contenders, but really they're pretenders and they need to do some active retooling, and they're just on the cusp, but they can't really compete with top tier teams. They're scoring well, they're winning some games, but they're just not really there. I think what I'm saying. What those kind of teams look like. Like they're doing okay, they're winning games, but they're just, they're kind of fluky, whatever the case may be. And I know that when you get into the playoffs, like anything can happen. You can catch fire late. You could have a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown just pop off for the last 6 weeks of the year, whatever the case is. But if you're a middling team at best, when you get into the playoffs, if you want to say that anything's in the realm of possibilities that you win, you could always also lose the first round and be the 7th pick in the draft. Next year we think is a better draft, but you don't really want to be there. You want to be closer to the top or you want to be in the back because you're winning the league. There's not really a lot of in the middle ground you want to be in. So I'd rather, take that step back, know where I'm at amongst the league, look at things like points for, maximum points for, points against. And you can really, if you audit your team like that, you can really see if you're fraudulent or if you're a true contender. If you're in the top tier of scoring and you're winning games, and even if your points against is really high, you're probably set to make a run in that league, especially if all things considered going forward throughout the course of the season, like your team's healthy, which, isn't always perfect. Usually you're dealing with some kind of injury, but and you're still just steady Eddie rocking and rolling, you can make a run. But most teams, or a lot of the times I see, is teams that, and then what happens is then you go and make these win now moves, sacrifice your future, assets, which could, put you over the top, could put you into the next tier. But sometimes people are too afraid to make those moves because they feel like they're already a top tier team. So it's just kind of a tough place to be. And this is just one where, I think this is how most teams end up stuck in the middle, is because they feel like they're too good and they're afraid to make those moves because they don't think they have to. But then that comes at the expense of your overall assets and where you finish in the league. What are your thoughts here, Zach, when it comes to overrating your roster and how to fix this mistake?
Yeah, I mean, the hardest thing to do is look within yourself and be honest, right? And I tell this story a lot because my favorite thing to do is take over teams. It's like a project, I do like startup drafts, but even in a startup draft, what I do in a startup draft? I make that team bad. I make that team bad. I get a bunch of first round picks. I like the project of completely starting from ground zero. And so I took over a team that won a championship. And I'm like, and this is literally within the last week or two. I took over that team. I didn't do it. I took over the team after the rookie draft. I don't know what happened to the owner, or it fell off, whatever. Took over the team, looked at the team. I had the little ribbon on Sleeper that I won. I'm like, oh, cool. Awesome. Easy money. I'm going to win this league this year. Week 1, I lose. And I'm like, damn, what the hell happened? So I take a deeper look at this team and I see that this team has Rashad Penny, and I think it was Justin Jackson, who filled in for Austin Eckler last year, week 17, which is the fantasy championships, right? Justin Jackson had an unreal game, I think 30 points. Rashad Penny had an unreal game last year. And I'm looking at this team and I've got no depth whatsoever. I think I got Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp. It's a beautiful team. I don't think I have Cooper Kupp in that league, but it's a beautiful team. And I lose week 1. And I say, how did this team win last year? I've got no depth. I'm starting Rashad Penny at running back. That's not where I want to be in the long-term picture. Right. And it's like, okay, how did this team win? Or how did this team, if in your situation, how did this team lose Why did this team lose? Why did this team win? This team won because it got completely lucky that Rashad Penny and Justin Jackson went off on week 17. Other than that, I mean, that was like 60, 70 points right there from those two players, which are just not reliable players and not reliable a year from now, 2 years from now, and certainly not 3 years from now. I had to take a look at that team and say, I've got so many good pieces. I'm hoping that lightning strikes in a bottle twice to win a championship here. So what I did was I sold Tyreek Hill, I sold Stephon Diggs, and I've got 4 first-round picks in the 2023 draft class. I still got a lot of good pieces. I think I got Josh Allen in that league. I think I have Mark Andrews. It's a really good team with good pieces, but it wasn't going to win this year. It just wasn't going to happen. I could have made a move to try to compete this year again. And I'm still not completely like, I think I could probably make the playoffs in that league and see what happens. You have to take a look within yourself sometimes with these teams and say, you said, Bob, look at the max PF, look at the points against. What is that story telling? Well, what did last year tell you about this team? What did last year tell you about how your team performed or how the team that you took over performed? Because if you won because Justin Jackson got the start and got 30 points, that's not something you can rely on. And you can't build on that. You can't say, oh, I'm going to keep Justin Jackson on my roster for whenever Austin Eckler gets hurt. You have to take a look within yourself sometimes, and you have to make a painful decision. Like, I didn't like selling Tyreek Hill. I'm a Dolphins fan. All right, like I didn't like selling Tyreek, but it netted me like a first-round pick and a second-round pick, and I can't remember the specific trade, but that trade made me better. And then I'm actually now 2-1 in that league. So you never know how these things go. But sometimes you have to make the tough decision. Sometimes it's not like, I have this uber competitive team. Sometimes it's, let me hit a soft reset here. Let me acquire some draft capital. I can use that in the draft, or I can use that in a trade. At some point, I can get 2 assets for that 1 pick or whatever it may be. I can tear down to a second-round pick and an extra player. So, sometimes you have to make that difficult decision of saying, this team, it looks very good on paper, but it's not viable long-term, which again is what we're here for. We're here for the long-term. We're here for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. This is not a redraft show. This is Dynasty Rewind. Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes you just have to, really look at the makeup of your roster and make a tough decision.
Yeah, I think not being afraid to take that step back, and you really need to evaluate where the assets you have on your team are. Like, do you have a bunch of guys that are about to age out? Guys like Austin Eckler who, probably getting closer to the cliff rather than he isn't. Same with guy like Travis Kelce, guys like that are, not going to be super valuable going forward, and you're still not, knocking on the door of a championship. If you're still middle of the road with those guys, buddy, I hate to tell you, it's time to say goodbye and move on and see what you can do to reset yourself. And like you said, I think that's an awesome way to put it, is a soft reset. I don't think you need to tear it all down, but what guys aren't going to help you next year? What guys are going to start losing value the second this season ends and be really, really hard to get the same value for over the course of the offseason. Those are 2 guys that I think are going to be darn near impossible to move once this season concludes. And you might be lucky enough to be able to move them close to the trade deadline. Know where you're at a month of league. Are you a top scorer? Is your team intact? Are you ready to make that run, or are you not? Make those tough decisions. And like always, there's always context behind the numbers. If you're a low scoring team, but you're winning games, what's your points against? Are you just, nobody's putting up points against you, so you're still winning games? There's always more to dive into once you start to dissect the situation you're in. But it's a tough one because it's an easy thing to think that your roster's good. And the thing is with that too, is everybody's really big on that coming into the season. Almost everybody thinks they're a competitive team come week 1. Then they get the world shook after, bust centric, Allen Robinson, Cam Akers, all those guys light up your roster, set your starting roster on fire week 1. And then you end up, falling short, and then you're in a tough spot if you don't know how to bounce back from that. This one isn't as big of a, crazy mistake, but I do think it's something to reel back a little bit. And that's trading with predictive draft landing spots in mind. And that means, where do we think next year's first round picks from this team are going to end up? When we're trading for a draft pick, I think it's not necessarily foolish to put an early label on it, because I think what happens is you're going to end up putting too much value into that pick when you trade for it. You're going to send too much to acquire that pick when there's just so much that can happen between now and then, especially if you're sending, players that can help that team actually better their pick, because all you're going to do then is just back that pick up and hurt yourself that much more. If a team is definitely trash, we all know what a trash team looks like. If the team's starting, backups because they have to, okay, they're probably a bad team. They're probably a team that you can probably pencil in for a top 3 to 4 pick. Especially this early in the season, when we get around like week 8, 9, 10, we could probably start making those adjustments, those loose assumptions we could start making. But now it's just too early. If you're trading for teams' first round picks, like I said, you're going to be sending good assets to get those picks, especially if that team knows that that's going to be a high pick. They're going to charge a premium for it, and they probably shouldn't move it yet. They should probably hold on to that pick. So if you have one of those picks, hold on to those picks until you're in the draft if you really want to move it, because you'll be able to get a lot more then. But, Zach, what are your thoughts on this one, between just having so much that can happen with that first round pick, not wanting to invest too many assets, etc.? I think this is a dangerous game to play, especially with, even with second, third, any round pick. I think it's a kind of a dangerous game to play.
I'm conflicted on this, because I hear what you're saying. And there are going to be people who watch this video who are in leagues with me who are like, that guy, because I do this both ways. I'm not gonna lie. This is my confessional to you right here. I do this both ways. I use this for me, and I use it against other people as well, because I'm all about the dialogue when it comes to a trade. I'm not here's an offer, reject, counter. No, I have a dialogue with the owner. Hey, is this guy available? And if he is, what do you want? So let's not waste each other's time here. I'm not trying to guess what you want or what you need. What are you interested in? What would it take? Is this player available? That's how I start almost every trade. And then, when we get into the dialogue aspect of it, I use that predictive draft pick thing for me, and I don't let other people use it against me. I'm like, oh, no. I can't base this trade off that pick landing in the top of the round. I can't do that, but I will use it for me as well. And that's why I'm saying people are going to watch this video and hate me. Go ahead, Bob.
It's funny you say that, because I always used to use the strategy of, if I was receiving a pick, I would always assume that it's going to be at the end of the round, of whatever round it's coming from. And if I was sending a pick, I would always assume that it's going to be higher end of the round, even though I know that, if my teams are competing, it's probably not going to be at the end of, at the beginning of the round, I should say. I just think it's funny you mentioned that, because that's kind of the same thought process of the thing with that, though, is it does tilt the trade a lot in both directions. If you're, assuming that pick that they're sending is going to be late when it's not, it does damage the value. But I get what you're saying. It is kind of just a bit of gamesmanship. And I think I've always leaned on that because, and this is kind of my fix for this mistake, is I always just back it up. Just if I think it's going to be early, I'm going to assume it's going to be a mid, just because I think moving that back that little bit is just a little bit more realistic, and it can kind of just provide a little bit more of a window for me to account for that possibility on the back end of the trade, where I'm making that trade make more sense for me. And same thing with a mid. If it's a mid and I'm pretty confident in that, I'm going to value it as a late, just to have that kind of baked into the cost of whatever I'm moving in that trade to make that trade make sense. But continue on, Zach.
Yeah, and it's like you said, when you get closer to the trade deadline, it's hard to say to somebody, hey, I can't account for that being an early pick, because you probably can, right?
You're 0-8. I don't think it's going to be an early pick.
I'll give you an example of last year where this kind of not bit me in the butt, but where it could have bit you in the butt is, let's say last year, 2021, and this was a team in one of my leagues where this owner had James Conner, and everybody was over James Conner after 2020. Like, nobody was interested in James Conner. He wasn't even the starting running back in Arizona. And there was a team, they were not good. They had James Conner. And I think Chase Edmonds missed the last few weeks of the 2021 fantasy season, not the NFL, the fantasy season, like weeks 11 through weeks 14. And James Conner, I think, had 19 touchdowns last year and was the RB5 in the fantasy landscape. Yep. So this team had James Conner, plugged him into his lineup, and lo and behold, he won like the last 4 games. And now that 101 is now 105. And that changes a lot, So again, you have to I think the word gamesmanship is perfect. And again, there are going to be people who watch this video who when they're hearing me say this, because I do it to them, and it's part of the Dynasty game, and it's why I love Dynasty. Is like it's this. For me, it's like a chessboard, and how can I move the pieces where I need them to go? I need this piece over here. So yeah, listen, I can't account for this guy is 0-7, but it could be that could be a mid-round pick. I can't so there's situations where I use it to my advantage, and then I use it against teams. So I totally I hear what you're saying. Like, I in a trade will not accept their explanation of where that pick will land, but I will make sure where I believe this pick is going to land.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's definitely an interesting game, like you said. Just kind of, I think the issue is though, just people, that pick's going to be a top pick when they're trading for it, and that's how they justify making a trade of sending like CD Lamb, for example. I'm pretty sure I saw this in the YouTube comments, and I don't mean to call anybody out, but I'm pretty sure that somebody at one point was saying that they traded CD Lamb and something else, I don't remember what, for what was surefire to be a top 3 2023 pick. And I'm like, right now that doesn't look bad. But say that team catches fire, and they were going to be the number 2 or 3 pick. They have a James Conner situation happen, and now they're the number 6 or 7 pick. That for CeeDee Lamb doesn't really look great. And I know that CeeDee Lamb ain't off to a hot start. He's not paired with Dak and whatever, but it's just one of those things I hate using or seeing that, because I just think that's poor process more than anything. Like, because you might be right. You might be absolutely right. That could be a top 3 pick. Sure. I'm not going to say it's not. It's too early to tell for any of these teams and for any of those teams. But I just think it's poor process. And that's, at the end of the day, correcting the process with the fix, assuming that later range, so you're not overvaluing the pick, or at least have that consideration baked into that offer of what you're trying to do to get the deal done in your range of outcomes.
In that hypothetical trade, CeeDee Lamb could make that team better when Dak Prescott comes back. So
exactly,
you're trading basically a player that goes in the first round of a startup draft. For you to hope that it's a top first round pick, to me, is not good enough. And that's exactly the reasoning I'd use there. Like, look, this guy goes first round startup draft. If at worst, first pick of the second round. I can't trade that on the hopes that this is going to be 101, 102, 103. I can't, I couldn't do that. That's a huge gamble. And that is how you fall back in Dynasty. You trade CeeDee Lamb and all of a sudden it's 107. Great. Now you're getting Sky Moore. Like,
right.
Now you're getting Christian Watson, so as opposed to Drake London, like it was last year. So it's a big risk to take on your part. That's how in Dynasty football you get behind the 8 ball. Is you make a move and it just you trade away a surefire asset. Whether or not CeeDee Lamb puts up wide receiver 1 numbers this year, he will still go top 2 rounds in a startup draft next year. That's for sure. So, you don't want to put yourself in a deficit like that, because to try to crawl out of it is tough.
Yeah, for sure. The last little bit I'll add to that is just that if you're going to make a move like that and try not to affect that pick, move like injured players or something, J.K. Dobbins last year, Trey Lance this year, if it's a super flex, for an early pick next year, that might not be a terrible move. But I just, anytime you're hoping, that pick ends up high, to make a deal make sense, to make it valuable in your opinion, or at least in your eyes, I think that's when you're setting yourself up for trouble. Moving on to the last mistake I have, and Nate's touched on this a little bit, but I want to, take it a step further. And his idea is rebuilding too slow, or not making the first step to rebuild. But I'm also going to say on top of that, not moving aging vets and letting their values die on your roster. This is just one of the worst things I think you can do, is because there should never be a point. And I know, we want to build around players. We want to have players we like on our rosters. Just because you like vets, it's okay to move them. It's okay to get them off your roster for something. Instead of seeing signs and starting the rebuild, you try to make one last playoff push, or you're in denial. You look back at number 3, our tip today, of overrating your own roster, thinking you're going to win a championship, but really you're stuck in the middle. But say you rebuild too slow, you don't make the moves needed. Now your assets are 1 year older. That much harder to move, that much less valuable. In all honesty, if you wait past the trade deadline, if your league has one, I know some leagues don't, but you could effectively be adding a year onto what could have been a fairly quick rebuild, depending on what the pieces are you're moving. If you're moving a piece like, Mike Evans is always a good one I throw around, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams. If you're moving one of those guys, you could probably effectively move those guys for, let's say, a Chris Olave, a Drake London, maybe plus for any of those assets. Maybe, like I said, not all trades are definitive. It's just an example. Whereas if you just sit there and let them die on your roster, those are all guys that I think you can agree are going to be dramatically less valuable the second the season ticks over, and the second we start looking at next year. And then you're not getting, you're maybe having to send additional assets with Devontae Adams to get a Chris Olave. Whereas if you just did it a little earlier, you're actually getting the piece back depending on that situation. But, what are your thoughts here, Zach? Looking at this rebuilding too slow, or, not getting those aging veterans off your roster. Why is this so important and such a mistake we need to avoid?
Yeah, I think, you tried to give examples of players who that is on the brink. I'll give you a player that's already happened to. How about DeAndre Hopkins? I know that he's suspended now, and I'm sure that he will produce in the 10 games or 11 games that he will play, but he will never be a top 10 dynasty wide receiver ever again. You look back, I'm looking in a half PPR here. From 2017 to 2020, he was the wide receiver 1, 2, 4, and 4 in Dynasty. Then in 2021, he was the wide receiver 45. So you missed that boat. Now, I'll say this. You do make yourself better by avoiding that cliff, right?
Yes.
But I there is something to be said. Like, listen, I like this player and I'm going to build with this player. And, if hypothetically, like this player retires on my team, it's not the best situation ever. But if you are building a team long-term, like for me, I have Tyreek Hill on one of my rebuilding teams right now. A, he plays for my hometown team. B, he's still damn good. I know the cliff is coming soon. It could be a year. It could be 2. It could be 3 years from now. I know that that's coming. That, that speed doesn't last till you're 33, 34. But at the same time, like he's making my team win games right now. My plan in that league is to be competitive in 2023. And I think that Tyreek Hill still does that. So will I miss the potential value that I could get in a trade now? Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Like I know that that's coming. The hamstring injuries are coming. That just happens to players that rely on their speed, that when, they're 27, 28, that's not going to be there when they're 32, 33. But at the same time, if that player can help you win games now, like I know that Olave can kind of help me win games, but look at Olave, right? Like this first quarter of the season, getting 13 targets a game, but he can't score a damn touchdown. Like,
yeah,
it's like a DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin situation here happening with Chris. Listen, I don't want to
put that on him.
I know, but I'm just it's a little concerning thus far.
I agree.
That Garrett Wilson and Drake London and Jahan Dotson are scoring touchdowns, and Chris Olave, who
Romeo
was like,
Dobbs.
Yeah, Romeo Dobbs. Like besides George Pickens, Chris Olave is like he had probably one of the better situations of any of the rookie wide receivers, and it's like, can you score some touchdowns, please? Like that offense doesn't look that great, Like I agree. I would love to move Tyreek Hill for Chris Olave plus, but Tyreek Hill also helps me win now and win next year and potentially win 2 years from now. So it's a case to case situation. Like we've talked about this ad nauseum here. Examine your team. Where does your team sit in a year or 2 from now? And can you move? Like I moved on that same team. I moved Dalvin Cook last year because I'm like, Dalvin Cook's not helping me win in 3 years. Tyreek Hill might, but Dalvin Cook is not helping me win in 3 years. You have to examine the players, what you can get in return. Do they help you win? Do they help you win when you're trying to win? So on and so forth. But, I'm not always going to move a player to like maximize on their trade value, because there is something to be said about like, hey, if you're an uber competitive team and you still have DeAndre Hopkins, he can still help you. He can help you on a bye week, or he may still be a wide receiver 2 in fantasy football, though he won't be this year because he's already going to miss 6 games. Like that'd be statistically impossible. But you get what I'm saying. He still may be relevant. Adam Thielen is still relevant. He's 33, 34. It's a case-to-case situation for me. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, like know your team, know your construct, know your plan, and then move forward with that.
I can definitely agree with all that. And I think being case by case, I am somebody who I will just about always find a way to get cash in on that peak value, because I'm just so against missing out on value. If I miss a sell window, I'm pissed. And that's even for guys like Antonio Gibson, who I think have a chance to be relevant in this league longer.
I told you that was coming, though.
Yeah, we know, Zach. But and the thing is I just never found a deal I was really comfortable moving him with either, too. So it was just kind of like just a crap situation. I never want to let that value die on my roster. So I want to always be. And the thing about it is, too, because like if you have that mindset, it's like, well, once a player hits peak value, you're just never going to have good players on your roster because you're constantly turning them over. And the idea is that, you have the value staggered out, where, one person's time's ticking, probably get rid of them soon. The next guy down, he's got a couple years yet, but it's somebody to start thinking about. Then you go down and down and down, and these guys are all further away than the guy that was on top, so that you're building out your roster with players that still have long-term viability, but also short-term guys, because you have to just kind of keep greasing the wheel. As you turn the wheel, the next valuable asset, the guy that's producing, that's a wide receiver one, is ready to tick up. But then the guy that's at the top, see you later before his value goes down. And that's, this is specifically for me at like wide receiver. It's harder to do at running back, I think. But just to get these guys off your roster before they lose value, I think is such a huge, it's just one more way to build up that asset pool and still keep your roster going, especially if you can kind of start, once you get really good at it and you're fleshing out your full roster with wide receivers, or God forbid, or somehow you can put together 5 decent running backs. God, that's tough. I mean, putting the 3 together these days is tough. When you can put together a ton of wide receivers where you can just kind of keep, once one's getting close, tick him off the roster, the next guy slots in as your wide receiver 1. You get to trade down and maybe you have him slotting in as your wide receiver 4 right away, but then you get that plus asset on top that can go into your draft pool. I mean, that greasing the wheel right there is how you really do damage going forward.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'll add to that is it may be more difficult, but I think it's better to do that with the running back position than the wide receiver position, because like I said, DeAndre Hopkins can still have value in his 30s, but what running back can we remember in the last 10 years was a RB1 in their mid-20s and then went into the 30s and was still an RB2 to RB3? Doesn't happen. Maybe if you really stretch this thin, like Mark Ingram.
Sure.
Maybe.
Yeah. I think, because I'd love to be able to do that with running backs. I just think it's so hard to be able to have one that's competitive, or 1 or 2 that's competitive, and then be able to flip them and still have like somebody that can slot in to be 90% of what he was, and then somebody slot under him that's 90% of what he was. Right. So you don't really lose a lot there. It's just easier to do at wide receiver. If you can find a way to do it at running back, by all means, I am all about doing that. That tier down, that projected tier down lateral trade that I've been discussing all offseason. If you can find a way to do that, man, at running back consistently and keep up production, because that's when you need running back, is when you're competing anyway. I mean, if you can do that at those 2 positions, and then you have Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews at quarterback and tight end, or some, awesome duo at quarterback and tight end for the long haul, you're set. You're going to be a dynasty forever. You're never going to age out. If you can just keep that gear turning, you've won the league. You're going to be a top 3 team every year. And it's hard to get there. You have to kind of, go through the mud and the muck first of getting those assets. Maybe your team isn't great for the first few years or whatever, but once you get to that point, and I know that's an ideal scenario, and if you're in a league with a bunch of us or a bunch of people that watch the channel, I'm sorry, it's not necessarily going to happen, because everybody's going to be trying to do the same thing. But once you can get there, if you can get there, especially in your other leagues, there's thousands of leagues out there. You have to be in some without all of us, or people that are using the same ideas. I mean, you're just going to be in such great shape for the long haul. While that is it for this video, I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What mistakes are you no longer going to make in Dynasty Fantasy Football? And hey, while we cleared up some mistakes today, you won't want to make these mistakes while trading. Be sure to check out the 2 videos on your screen right now so you don't make any mistakes while you're setting up trades with your league mates. But hey, that's going to be it for me today. I will see y'all in the next one, but until then, y'all have a good one.